Welcome to our lesson about applying dimensions. Let's start by creating a sketch on the top plane. Click outside to deselect everything, and let's create a circle. You'll remember that we talked about callouts in a previous lesson. Callouts are the numbers that appear right next to my cursor. The callout gives me an approximate size of my geometry, radius here about 27 millimeters. I will still need to apply dimensions to fully define this entity. Let's left-click and place our circle. Now let's activate the rectangle tool using the parallelogram method. I'll select my first point. Now the callouts display the current distance and angle of this potential segment, 55 millimeters at 45 degrees. Let's left-click to accept that position. Now the callouts display distance and angle for the segments that close the profile. And let's right-click and choose Select to close the tool. Windows Select and delete that geometry. Let's create a rectangle via the corner method now. Left-click. Now if I left-click at this point, my rectangle has approximate size 46 by 39 millimeters. At some point during my mousing, I have a potential square, as the callouts display at that point x equals y at 46 millimeters. Now if I left-click, SOLIDWORKS will automatically apply an equal relation to all sides of this square. Let's switch to the arc tool. We'll use the three-point method. Let's place our first point. Callouts display the length of the arc segment at this point, now approximately 70 millimeters. Let's left-click. Now the callouts display the radius and angular values. Let's make it approximately 180 degrees. Let's take a look at a center point arc now. Now our callouts show us a potential radius, and secondly, the angle of the arc. Right-click and select to close the tool. Let's Windows Select and delete all this geometry. I'm going to drop a rectangle in the middle of my graphic area. Right-click and select to close the tool. Now I can grab any corner of my rectangle and drag it freely. This is because the sketch is underdefined, meaning it's not yet fixed in space. First thing I'm going to do is Shift-select the origin point and this corner. I'm going to add a coincident relation between these 2 points. Now 2 lines of my rectangle are black. In SOLIDWORKS, when my sketch is fully defined, all of it will appear in black line. The other 2 lines here are still blue. That means I can grab and drag them. The left corner is now attached to the origin point. It's fixed in space now, and I'm not able to move it. Now let's go ahead and apply some dimensions, some sizing. We'll click on the Smart Dimension flyout arrow and choose Smart Dimension. The rest of the dimensions we'll take a look at later on in this course. I'll select this line, drag and drop to position the dimension, and the dimension input box appears. We can enter the value manually with our keyboard. For example, let's type in 40 millimeters and click Update. We can also use the scroll wheel to specify the dimensions. And as a third option, you can click on these arrows next to the input field. This adjusts your dimension value using increments that you define by clicking here. Close. We can also reverse the dimension. Click here. Notice we have the ability to use negative dimensions in SOLIDWORKS. I'm going to input 50 millimeters and click Accept. Now right-click and select to close the dimension tool. So now I've got 3 black lines and 1 blue line. The corners coincident to the blue line can still be moved, and the rest is fixed in space. The status bar tells us that the geometry remains underdefined. We can exit the sketch at this point, leaving the sketch underdefined. Let's take a look at Sketch 1's node in the tree. The minus sign tells us that this sketch is underdefined or not fully constrained. Let's right-click and edit this sketch. What we're going to need is a second dimension or an equal relation if we want to create a square, for example. Let's activate the Smart Dimension tool. And we'll set a value for the length at 60 millimeters. Accept, and my sketch is in complete black line now. The sketch is fully defined per the status bar. Let's accept and exit. The node for Sketch 1 no longer displays the minus symbol. Okay, let's edit the sketch. Let's see what happens if I add one more dimension, even though the sketch is already fully defined. SOLIDWORKS gives me a warning, asking me if I want this new dimension to be driving or driven. If I leave this dimension as a driving dimension, the sketch is going to be what's called over-defined. In other words, SOLIDWORKS won't know which parameter to use in its calculations. Let's select Driven. Let's make this dimension Driven instead and click OK. Right-click and select to close the tool. Notice the last dimension I added is in gray color rather than black. Let's double-click on that dimension to edit it. SOLIDWORKS lets me know that in fact I'm not able to edit this dimension because it's a driven dimension. Let's click OK. Let's take a look at another example of why a driven dimension may be useful. Let's delete all that geometry. Now activate the Line tool and create a right triangle. Now let's dimension the vertical and horizontal segments. 40 millimeters here, OK. And 30 millimeters here. OK. Lastly, let's add a dimension to the hypotenuse. Notice that when I mouse over this segment, I toggle between different dimension types, horizontal, vertical, and the third type of dimension called aligned. To lock the dimension, right-click when you've got the one you want. Now my mouse movements don't give me the dimension type choices. To unlock the dimension type, right-click again, and now I toggle between the types. Left-click to place the dimension you want. Make dimension driven, yes and OK. And we right-click and select to close the dimension tool. Our sketch is still blue, underdefined. I'm able to grab it and freely move it in the graphic area. In order to fully define this sketch, I'm going to need to fix a point in space. Let's select this point here, and we'll apply a fix relation. Now the sketch is black and fully defined. Let's change the length of one segment. Double-click on the dimension to edit it. Let's say 50 millimeters instead. OK. Let's take a look at the hypotenuse dimension. Because that's a driven dimension, it's calculated by other geometry. The hypotenuse has adjusted accordingly. Let's see what happens if I add too many dimensions or relations. This time, let's make the hypotenuse a driving dimension. And let's leave this dimension as driving and click OK. And SOLIDWORKS clearly lets us know that we've got a problem. We are over-defined. Let's click on the red warning text in the status bar. The Sketch Expert opens to help us solve this problem. We have the option to diagnose or to manually repair this issue. Let's diagnose. SOLIDWORKS gives us 5 solutions, and we can cycle through them by clicking on these arrows. Each solution is displayed in the graphic area. Now let's click Manual Repair. Then select the dimension or relation I want to delete and press Delete. And as a result, the sketch can now be solved. Let's click Accept to exit the Sketch Expert. After placing our dimensions, we're able to move them. When I select a dimension, 2 handles appear. I can grab the handles and then just drag the dimension to reposition it. And let's drag my dimension up here. Release the mouse to reposition. Let me pan these entities down, and let's try another example now. Activate the Circle tool, and let's place our circle about here. Smart Dimension. I'll measure from this vertex to the center of the circle. Here's the dimension input box. Let's accept the default value. Now let's say I don't want to dimension from the circle center, but from this point here. I simply grab the dimension handle and drag it to the new point from which I want to create the dimension. Right-click and select to close the tool. Now to fully define the sketch, I'm going to select this point and add a fix relation. Lastly, let's learn how to dimension the length of an arc. First, let's create an arc. Smart Dimension. Select the first point and the second point. Now to dimension the length of the arc, I click on the arc itself. And let's place the dimension right here. I'll accept the default value, right-click and select to close the tool. And this concludes our lesson about dimensions.